Welcome back to another webinar by Urban Yogis. So my name is Kathy, and today we have Gernot again, who will be kind of putting into practice a lot of his philosophy that he has sort of expounded on in the previous webinar. So if you haven't checked that out, it's actually now available on YouTube. So I'm going to let Gernot take it away from here.
Hi, Kathy. It's great to be back. So my whole approach to yoga is figuring out how I can make my practice smarter than my habits. And the reason that is important is that when we all know that exercising is better for us than not exercising, but that doesn't mean just pushing as hard as you can all the time is the best way to get the most out of your exercise. And in yoga, we've got several other layers of stuff going on anyway, mindfulness and joy. But even if we just focus on the physical benefits, pushing as hard as you can is not the best way to make your exercise as beneficial as it can be. And the reason is that when we push as hard as we can, the way we motivate ourselves to do that is to set goals. So in yoga, in king pigeon pose, you might decide you really want to be able to reach your foot with your hands behind your head, sort of classic example. But whenever you set an external goal like that, you end up wanting to get to that goal with the least amount of effort possible. And that makes sense as a sort of, of course, like, why not? The reason why not, what it means to go farther with less effort means to only engage the muscles you're good at engaging and only bend the joints that bend with ease. So when you follow this goal-oriented approach to practice, you end up ignoring your weak muscles, you don't strengthen your weak muscles, and you ignore moving your tight joints. It's just, you have to create too much effort to get something going in those places. And it just doesn't seem worthwhile because you're not getting very far. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go through a series of poses where this idea becomes really clear, where we move in such a way that we feel like we're going farther. And usually that means either reaching the fingertips higher or pointing the gaze farther up or farther down. And then we'll sort of deconstruct what's going on in all the different parts of the body and see if the pose is if we're actually doing what we're thinking we're doing. If we're really strengthening what we think we should be strengthening in a particular pose. No?
Great. Okay, I'm ready. I'm going to get on my mat now.
All right, I'll get on my mat too.
Yeah.
So first one, we can actually just face the camera if you like. And now, part of this issue, let me turn off my notifications. This issue is exacerbated by lots of common yoga instructions that actually encourage people to have a goal-oriented focus. So yoga teachers will say, inhale and reach your arms to the ceiling. Yeah? Notice how that feels. Bring your arms back down, right? And again, in those words is contained this idea that, farther is better. Like reaching your fingers as high as you possibly can makes this movement somehow more beneficial. I would argue that's not true. So for comparison, do this. Inhale, allow your arms to float up. Let your breastbone, actually let's back off. Let just your breastbone float up for a moment as you inhale. Let your arms dangle. Exhale, let the breastbone settle back down. Inhale, let your breastbone float back up. Let your collarbones broaden. Let that movement ripple out into the arms. Exhale, let the breastbone settle back down. Keep exaggerating the movement of the breath, letting the breastbone float up. The collarbones broaden as you inhale, and as you exhale, let everything settle back down. Notice that as you inhale, your arms begin to rotate out and maybe even float up a little bit. On your next inhale, allow that movement to be exaggerated until your arms actually float up almost without effort. And then notice where you end up. Your arms don't end up as high. Your fingertips will not be as close to the ceiling as before. I guarantee that, right? go from here to the previous one, just stretch up and notice that what you're adding to the pose to get your fingertips higher is neck tension. All right, I'm gonna just come close to the camera for a moment. Ask yourself, do you need more neck tension in your life? And the answer is
No.
probably no. So if you add neck tension to this pose, are you making your practice smarter than your habits? Or are you just replicating the same patterns that are already causing you problems in your real life in your yoga practice? And I would argue that that's not very smart. Yeah. So lifting, and then there are actually biomechanical reasons why lifting the arms with neck tension is more potentially dangerous for your shoulders than lifting them without that neck tension. I won't get into those here. Yeah. But suffice it to say that floating the arms up puts you in a position that probably feels more comfortable and allows you to breathe better than if you're reaching your fingertips as high as you can get them. You might say, well, but I don't think exercise is about being comfortable, is it? I would actually argue that it is. Because if you think that exercise must be painful, must be horrible, you're actually not getting as much out of it. There's lots of evidence showing now that people who enjoy their exercise literally get more out of it. Okay, so let's continue on. That was pose number one. So in all the poses, notice yourself reaching for an external goal and notice how that compromises your breath. And then we're going to reconfigure these poses to allow them to emerge from the breath so they're not compromising the breath anymore. So we can face sideways now for this.
Okay.
So one more time, inhale, let your breastbone float up. Let your collarbones broaden. Feel your arms move. Feel the movement ripple out into the arms. Exhale, let everything settle back down. Inhale, breastbone floats up, collarbones broaden, arms rotate out and float up. I don't care how high. I just want you to let this movement happen from the breath and then exhale, forward bend, standing forward bend. And then pause here. Observe your breath. And breathing in a forward bend is not the easiest place to breathe. Yeah? But notice your neck and whether you're holding on to neck tension. And Kathy, that's looking pretty good, but lots of people maintain that neck tension here,
They tend to do
especially
something like this, right?
yeah, or if you try to reach, so relax back down to where you were, and then now try to get your palms to the floor, which again is an instruction that is given sometimes, and some people feel like, well, it's not really uttanasana unless my palms are on the floor. But the easiest way to get your palms to the floor is again by tensing the back of your neck, right? It makes your arms longer.
Yeah, like that.
It's again reaching for an external goal. Does it really make the pose more beneficial? I would argue not. So what I do here is I hold on to my opposite elbow. So I let go of this external, I don't care where the floor is. And then I may play around with tilting my tailbone up a little bit more and to see if that frees my breath, if that creates a little bit more space in the front of the chest.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, inhale, come on up, come on out of the pose. So how do you make your practice smarter than your habits? I would argue any adjustment in any pose that allows you to breathe more freely is a useful adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is that when we reach farther with less effort, what we're giving up is that free and delicious breath. Because in order to reach farther, the easiest thing to do is to deform the shape of the spine. And that means compromising the breath. So for a simple, let's just do this is actually related to the pose we just did. Lie down on your back. So, and notice that your spine has its natural double S curve. It doesn't actually flatten into the floor. It maintains its natural shape because that natural double S curve maximally benefits our breath. Now, inhale your arms up and exhale them to the floor alongside your ears. And again, this is so I've told you to bring your arms to the floor. Now, you might actually decide not to bring them all the way to the floor, but that's kind of awkward. So let the hands come all the way to the floor, but then notice whether the shape of your spine has changed and whether your ability to breathe freely has been slightly compromised. Like the front of the chest is more open here, but the back of the rib cage has lifted off the floor and is kind of collapsing inward.
Would you
Why?
say this position of the diaphragm makes it very difficult for us to take in more air?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Because now our diaphragm is almost pulled out in this sort of fashion when we reach the hands
Yeah.
above our
Yeah.
ears, and our ribs have sort of fled, and our lower back is in more of an extension.
Exactly.
That would make it very difficult for someone to really breathe into their full capacity, would you say?
Right. So it's really difficult to breathe into the back ribs here because we have overarched our spine in order to get the arms all the way to the floor without having to stretch much of anything. What's tight here is the lats. And we're avoiding that lat stretch, or we're able to avoid it by arching the spine off the floor and compromising our breath. And this is just
Right.
one of many examples. So exhale, draw the lower front ribs in. Inhale, breathe into the back ribs. And if you can free your breath here, notice that will probably increase your lat stretch.
Yeah.
This is a universal pattern. This happens all
So
the time.
just for people who are watching at home, the lats are the muscles on the back.
So they connect your lower and middle spine, lumbar and lower thoracic spine, to your upper arm. And so if you lift your upper arm higher, you're pulling on that muscle, and you're pulling, in order to avoid the stretch, your lower and middle back have to overarch to keep those 2 points, the end points of the muscle, to not go too far apart. Yeah. Okay. So in Uttanasana, the opposite happens, right? What we tend to do in Uttanasana, where we just were, so back to the regularly scheduled program, we round the back in order to reach farther. And that rounding of the spine compromises the breath in the front. And so tilting your tailbone up behind you a little bit reduces the rounding of the spine and increases the flexion in the hips, which increases the hamstring stretch.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't. And if that hamstring stretch, if creating that hamstring stretch that you were previously avoiding through rounding your back a lot, if that frees your breath at the same time, which it does, then I'd say that's a useful thing to add here. Now, that doesn't mean you have to. So how far do you go? If you have to exert a lot of effort to tilt your tailbone up, you may be able to tilt it up a little bit more, but if the effort required is really high, then it won't free your breath, because now you're engaging all kinds of other muscles that are restricting your breath. So
Gernot, is it possible then, if we are going for that tilted tailbone and a less round in the back, would it be better for someone to use a prop, or what are some of the modifications that would be accessible for someone?
Yeah. So Uttanasana, if you have a significant lower back pain, then I would just skip that pose or bend the knees. It's because it's a pose where the tendency is really, the temptation to just over round the lower back and not stretch the hamstrings is so strong. And people who don't have good body awareness and good ideas about how to align themselves better in yoga, it's quite common for the stretch to concentrate on the lower back. So so one way to solve it is to keep the knees bent and to stop reaching, to just let yourself be where you are. And again, let yourself be in a place where you can still breathe. That's usually a good sanity check that you're not doing something terribly awful to your body, right? Your breath is a really good guide for that. Okay, let's move on to the next pose. Inhale halfway up, Ardha Uttanasana. And
this one's complicated.
yes, and I always say put your hands somewhere on your legs, right? Don't put your hands on the floor. Almost no one can do this pose well with their hands on the floor. Okay, so now you can bend your knees. That's one way to reduce the intensity of this pose. That's fine. What you just did was an interesting adjustment. You had a rather rounded lower back before, and now it's slightly arched. So which position allows you to breathe better?
This one.
Yeah, okay. And then I would say lengthen the back of the neck even more. So there's a tendency to want to look forward. In fact, again, there's an instruction, one of the classic instructions to come into this
Inhale,
pose
look
in Uttanasana.
forward.
You can come out for a second, Kathy, take a break. Yeah, is inhale, look up, right? Or
Yes.
inhale, look forward.
Look forward.
It's a terrible instruction because what is this pose about? Right? Let's sort of take a break for a moment. I would argue that Uttanasana is a forward bend. Everything is bending forward. But Ardha Uttanasana is not a forward bend. It's a forward fold, meaning we're intentionally flexing the hip joints, but we're keeping everything else neutral. Now, that's not how most people do this pose, but I would argue any pose that can be done with a neutral spine, you're better off doing it with a neutral spine. There are poses that clearly cannot be done. Like, I would not say try Uttanasana with a neutral spine. That doesn't make sense. But this pose can be done with a neutral spine. And so the way most people do it, and you're not doing it quite so um, poorly
Commonly.
aligned, but this is very common, right? You keep that rounding in your torso, and you just tense the back of your neck to make you feel like you're no longer down, you're halfway up. But again, does it really make sense to tense the back of the neck here? Is that necessary? Or is that a substitute for, like, you have an inkling that something needs to stop rounding forward, right? There is this coming up part. What's the easiest thing to bend back to come up? It's the neck. But can you breathe here? No, not really. So bring the hands a little bit higher and then move back towards that neutral spine. Tilt your tailbone up, let your breastbone float away from the belly button, and lengthen the back of the neck. So give that, okay, all right. So bring your hands even higher. Just put your hands on your knees for the moment. Okay. And did that free your breath?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. I think just from looking at you, I would say yes.
I have a question about the ribs, though. Would you encourage, because what tends to happen when people have their hands on their shins or on their knees, they tend to go into a hyperextension. So it kind of looks a little bit like they tend to do. Right. They tend to reach even further. So I understand that some cues work for some people, but when we try and get that flat back or the forward bend shape, there's that tendency as well.
So the thing is, we're not. That's a really good point, and that is really true. People are just like, oh, you want me to turn this into a back bend? Okay, I can, right? At least the flexible people will say, okay, I can do that. But again, it's that mentality of going farther, when what we're really looking for is returning to a neutral spine. A neutral spine is neither a back bend nor a forward bend, nor is it a flat back. It's a double S curve. And recreating a double S curve in this pose is actually ridiculously difficult. But in order to do that, you have to start, and it's so difficult because you have to use muscles you're not good at using. And so your brain has to figure out how to fire synapses it hasn't fired in years. And this is all really, really beneficial for your well-being, right? It literally, that's neurogenesis. Like that's like neuroplasticity here at work, right? You're building new connections in your brain. And you are beginning to engage muscles you're really good at normally avoiding engaging.
And also this idea of when you talked about the neck reaching forward, because that's the cue. That also heightens almost the primal reflex because of the, the way our head and our eyes will tend to dart forward. That makes our nervous system sort of kick into that fight or flight,
Absolutely.
response, because we're like, oh, we're on hyper alert now, because when we search for danger, this is kind of how we search.
Absolutely.
So naturally, when we sort of soften through the neck, almost, you could feel the breath ease, and it's almost like a coming together of systems. They're all speaking to one another in some way. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah. So really important point. Whenever you add neck tension to a yoga pose, and I would argue there isn't a single yoga pose that really requires neck tension. And if there's a one or two, then I will not practice those. If you use neck tension to get yourself into a yoga pose, then you're replicating that pattern of putting yourself into chronic stress that we're already really good at. And every time you choose not to, every time you relax that neck and that you notice that it's tense and you actually let it relax, you are learning how to not get stressed out when stressful things are happening. You're learning how to literally disrupt your stress response. And that's a powerful thing to learn. And pushing as hard as you can will never teach you that. Right. So let's see that pose one more time with even less neck tension. So if you feel like you're sending energy through your chin, redirect it through the crown of your head.
Would it also make sense to have my feet wider, because I feel like it frees up my pelvic floor a little bit here?
Absolutely. Again, I would actually say this is a truly universal alignment principle. Make space wherever there's a lack. If you feel like, and so my feet are usually hip distance. Yours look like they're already hip distance, but if you feel like bringing them even wider creates more space, absolutely experiment with that. Your spine is looking better and better, and then even more length in the back of the neck. If your torso is actually horizontal and your neck is neutral, you would be gazing straight down at the floor. So you're getting very close to that neutral spine now. Okay, relax out. And by the way, what I'm interested in is a neutral spine. I'm not interested in a neutral spine I'm not interested in it being horizontal. For some people, that's great. Like I can do a pretty horizontal spine, but if your hamstrings are really tight, you can still do a neutral spine. It might just not be horizontal. I'd much rather have you do this than this, where you feel like you might be horizontal. My shoulders are at hip level now, but everything in between, it has completely fallen out of alignment, and my breath can tell the difference, right?
And this is also probably really good because, I and a lot of Asians have very flat spines. So sometimes when we're doing certain poses, it looks like we're doing it really well, but that's because we naturally have so it's quite deceiving. So actually using the breath makes yoga a lot more accessible and more, I guess, universal, because we all have breath, but we have different body types.
Exactly. So what you need to do to free your breath may be slightly different from what I need to do.
Right.
But this is the one true sort of, and I wouldn't even call it a goal, because we're not naturally, like, freeing the breath is not something our ego is particularly interested in, right?
Yeah.
So don't think of it as a goal. Think of it about, what can I do right now in this moment in time to free my breath a little bit more? And I can virtually guarantee you that it will improve your practice. And okay, good. Let's move on from here. Exhale back into that forward bend. Relax the back of the neck. And then inhale, root your eyes, float back up. Again, without reaching. And exhale, swim home. And so when people transition from Ardha Uttanasana back to Uttanasana, they often don't let go of the neck tension, right? This is a really good place to remind yourself, hey, am I actually relaxing the back of the neck? Okay, let's do that little flow again, and then we'll step back into Trikonasana. And for that, no, let's do Warrior Two first, because for Trikonasana, I actually want to rotate your mat around. So let's do Warrior Two first. And
All
we'll
right.
you can step your left leg back so you'll be facing the camera. Okay?
Got it.
Top of your mat. Inhale, float up. On the breath, no reaching, just floating. Exhale, forward bend. Relax into the forward bend. Inhale, float halfway up on your breath. Place your hands high enough that you can actually free your breath. And then exhale, hands to the floor, bend your knees, step your right leg. Actually, you step your left leg back. Left leg back. Inhale your hands to your hips. So left foot behind, for Warrior Two, left foot behind the right, turning out. And then hands on your hips and bend the front knee. And then notice what your hips are doing. And for most people, the hips won't be level. The back hip will be higher.
And to go into a little bit of a booty.
Yeah, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So if you float your arms up into the sort of full pose, often that tendency increases because now you're feeling like, well, I'm a warrior. I'm about to stab somebody with my sword. And so there's this reaching forward. And how can you reach farther forward? Well, by lifting that back hip. But bring your arms back down. So hands on the hips is a useful little variation here, because your brain doesn't really know what your hips are doing, but your brain knows pretty exactly what your hands are doing. And so by putting your hands on your hips, your brain can figure out that, oh, the back hip is higher. Why is that? Well, what happens when you move the hips more towards neutral? Whenever you move more towards neutral, two things happen. One, you notice a stretch you were previously avoiding, and that's in the inner back thigh here, and also inner front thigh, but mostly back thigh. And your breath frees up, because if your shoulders were level, but your hips weren't, how can you achieve that? Only through a side bend in the spine. Come out of the pose for a second, just come up to standing. Compare how free your breath is in a neutral Tadasana versus in a Tadasana with a side bend in the spine, right? Because essentially, that's what you're doing in Warrior Two if you don't let your hips be level.
Right.
So, go ahead.
No, okay. Coming into Warrior Two.
Yeah.
So
and I like to put my hands right on top of the hip bones, because then I can, I know, okay, this is where the bone is ending. So I have a really good, it's hard to fake, it's hard to say, well,
it's
maybe
easier to engage the glutes when the hips are at that level place. There's less sort of tailbone reaching back out.
Yes.
You can get the tailbone down and pubic bone forward a little bit easier when you are orientating from this point. So that's actually quite useful.
Good observation. Yeah, I had never really quite realized, but I would agree. And then, yeah, if you want to sort of, and so notice one other thing. So notice that you've probably found a stretch you were previously avoiding. Your breath has freed up, but you now, in order to move your hips to level, you have engaged a bunch of core muscles that we're all good at ignoring usually, and you're feeling more stable. You're actually feeling more warrior-like. And then if you scoop the front sit bone underneath you a little bit more, you feel even more warrior-like. And then you can float your arms out and maybe play with lengthening the stance, but don't let that be the main focus. Free your breath.
So much
and
more
then
space.
Last inhale, exhale, step back to the front of your mat and relax the back of the neck. Again, notice how easy it is to maintain that neck tension there. And then float up and swim home. And I think we'll just skip the second side. People can do that on their own.
Let's go into Trikonasana.
We'll do Trikonasana, yeah? And for that, turn your mat 90 degrees.
All right.
That will give us a better view on what goes on here. And we'll just step the opposite leg back, so we'll get a somewhat symmetrical practice. So inhale, float up on your breath. No reaching, just floating. Exhale, flow down. Relax the back of your neck. Inhale, halfway up. just freeing the breath. And then exhale, step your right leg back, step it behind the left foot, and then come up from below or from above, however you like to come into the pose. And so this is another pose where there's clearly, like, there's a temptation to reach. There's a temptation to reach the lower hand closer to the floor, maybe put it all the way on the floor. And the easiest way to do that is to collapse the breath, to collapse the front of the chest. And then we like to stick the upper fingers back behind us to make us feel like we're getting farther. But if you can't breathe there, then again, you're sort of, there's a large group of people who, and you're doing a very neutral, open, spacious, breath-centered Trikonasana. So there's not much for me to
I find it very difficult to go any lower. Some teachers will cue to go down, and as soon as that happens, my neck starts going crazy.
Yes, right? Because again, to reach the arm lower, tensing the neck actually helps reach the arm farther. The other thing that helps here in this case is collapsing the front of the chest. And tensing the back of the neck and collapsing the front of the chest actually are also related biomechanically through this reflex called reciprocal inhibition. So, again, I encourage people to just bring that lower hand higher on the shin. And that often helps quite a lot. And then notice something else. Notice where your kneecap is pointing. And for most people, the kneecap is pointing diagonally. That's a clue that you are rotating this front thigh internally, which is causing your front hip to stick out. Why would you do that? Because it allows you to avoid a stretch. So go ahead and scoot that front, sorry, for you it's the left, to scoop the front sit bone underneath you. And then notice how that turns the kneecap out, so that the kneecap is now hopefully pointing more or less straight ahead. It's not that we care about where the kneecap is pointing, is that the kneecap pointing straight ahead tells us that the hip is in more neutral alignment. And notice how that frees your breath, how it stops that forward collapse. Nice. How does that feel? Because it's looking even better now.
More spacious, yeah.
Yeah, great. And that's like, again,
I can do without the hand completely. I don't want to.
Yeah, so like, right, the upper hand really is just, it's a flourish. It's like, it's not the essence of the pose, right? And so many people think, well, if I get my fingertips back there, I'm done, no matter what happens to all the parts in between. And that's, again, this is this goal-oriented thinking that I'm trying to disrupt.
What would you do about the pelvis then, Gernot?
Well, to me, the most important thing here is this scooping the front sit bone underneath, which realigns the whole pelvic girdle.
All right.
And then if there's, so I'll show this from the side, another tendency here sometimes is that there's a lot of a side bending going on, right? And then I might say, okay, can you move your lower ribs away from your left ribs away from your left hip crease?
That's very nice. So it immediately lengthens the lats, the intercostals.
And again, the main thing it does is it frees the breath. It undoes yet another way in which we've managed to compromise our breath, because it lets us reach the hand farther. Now, there's the top hand. I'll just show the other side it's this like, okay, well, my brain can sense that my right fingertips are above the front leg, and that makes me feel like I'm done, because my brain literally has no idea where the rest of me is. As long as the fingertips are there, I feel like I've accomplished the pose. But of course, I can't breathe. It feels awful because I can't breathe, but I'm so used to this being the only option that I have no idea I have other options. So one way to do this is bring the hand out of the pose. And now your brain can sense that, okay, maybe I actually am not really in the pose yet. And then free your breath and let the movement ripple out, and let the hand kind of float back up as a side effect of what I'm doing here,
Beautiful.
right? Moving from the inside out is much more effective in terms of creating true well-being than moving from the outside in. Because when you move from the outside in, you never get to the in part. You only end
Yeah.
up moving the outside, and you think, "Oh, I'm done. My fingertips are where I want them to be. What more could you possibly want me to do?"
Yeah.
Right?
Wow. But yeah, that was so insightful. I think we're almost at the time,
Okay.
but just
I,
so that people can know a little bit more, so Gernot has an amazing course out on Urban Yogis Academy, and it's called the Yoga Anatomy Toolkit. So, would you like to share a little bit about what people can expect and what can they learn, who the course might be for, and perhaps what are the upcoming courses you have in your lineup to say? Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, so this particular course focuses on the anatomical and biomechanical principles that cause us to fall into these ruts of habits. So if what I've been talking about makes sense to you and you want to know in greater detail why this happens and how it happens, this course is for you. It's not about memorizing body parts. It's about 12 ideas related to anatomy and biomechanics that will transform your understanding of how bodies work, how movement works, and why we end up moving in ways that aren't necessarily most beneficial for our well-being. It's
Mm.
not just for yoga teachers. If you're more interested sort of in technical details, but you're just a practitioner, this is absolutely for you. It's really not all that technical. If you already have taken a yoga anatomy course, like as part of a teacher training, this will be a great brush up
Supplement.
and a great sort of extension from there. It's not at all comprehensive. That's not the point. It's just highlighting a few things that I have found to be really powerful in improving my teaching and my practice. That's that course. The next one will be um, really for anyone who wants to practice yoga on any level. It's very much about figuring out, and that so it doesn't mean it's just for beginners. It's for anyone wherever they are to figure out, okay, what are the actual necessary steps I can take right now to make my practice more beneficial? Like, what is my practice? What is my body type? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How can I add what is missing? Because well-being is a matter of balance, and so it's really asking yourself, okay, what's missing? What do I need to add back into the mix? All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Gernot.
You're
I
welcome.
will, if you guys have any more questions, feel free to write in. If you want to connect with Gernot himself, we will leave his details in the description. Great. And you can get in touch with him separately.